Go ahead. Someone laughed from the back of the fellowship hall. If you're really the kindest man in town, ask Grace Bennet to dance. The room erupted with polite chuckles, the kind that sounded harmless until you looked into the eyes of the person they were aimed at. Grace lowered her gaze to the paper cup warming her hands, pretending not to hear the words she had spent nearly a decade pretending didn't hurt. Across the room, Ethan Walker stood beside the refreshment table with his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, helping arrange homemade pies for the annual Harvest Hope fundraiser at St. Andrew's Community Church in Cedar Ridge, Montana. It was supposed to be an evening about neighbors helping neighbors, laughter shared over casseroles, silent auctions, and country music drifting softly through old ceiling speakers. Instead, one careless joke had settled over the room like a cold November wind slipping through a cracked window. Ethan looked toward Grace without saying a word. He noticed what everyone else seemed determined to ignore. She had arrived early to decorate the tables. She had baked 2 apple pies that no one knew were hers. She had quietly volunteered every year, stacking chairs after everyone else had gone home, always leaving before sunrise touched the church parking lot. Yet no one invited her to sit with them. No one saved her a place. The faded scar tracing one side of her face had become the only thing many people remembered, as though kindness could somehow disappear beneath damaged skin. Lily tugged gently on her father's flannel sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, her small voice carrying more honesty than the room full of adults. "Why are they laughing?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. His weathered hands rested on the edge of the folding table, while the familiar scent of fresh coffee, cinnamon, and polished pine filled the hall. Outside, amber leaves tumbled across Main Street beneath the glow of old streetlights, and somewhere beyond the stained glass windows, a church bell marked the passing hour. For a brief moment, the laughter faded into an uncomfortable silence, replaced only by the quiet hum of the furnace and the distant melody of a fiddle playing through worn speakers. Ethan had learned long ago that the loudest moments in life rarely changed anyone. It was the quiet choices that echoed the longest. 3 years earlier, after losing his wife to illness, he had promised himself that Lily would never grow up believing another person's worth could be measured by appearance, money, or popularity. That promise had become the foundation beneath every ordinary day they shared. He finally looked down at his daughter and offered the gentle smile she knew so well. "Sometimes," he said softly, "people laugh because they haven't learned how to see." Lily nodded as if the answer made perfect sense. Then Ethan lifted his eyes toward Grace once more. She was already reaching for her coat, preparing to leave before the evening had truly begun, convinced once again that disappearing quietly would spare everyone else their discomfort. No one in that room realized they were about to witness a simple decision that would expose every hidden measure of the human heart. Grace had almost reached the front doors when she heard quiet footsteps behind her. She paused, expecting someone to ask her to stack another table or carry another box into storage before leaving, but instead she heard Ethan's calm voice. "Miss Bennet." She turned slowly, surprised that he had used her name. Most people simply nodded in passing or avoided speaking to her altogether. Ethan stopped several feet away, careful to leave her the comfort of space. Lily stood beside him, holding her father's hand with both of hers. The little girl smiled first. "Hi." Grace managed a hesitant smile in return. "Hello, sweetheart." For a moment, no one rushed to fill the silence. The soft strains of an old country hymn drifted through the fellowship hall, while volunteers continued laughing near the dessert table, unaware that something far more meaningful was unfolding near the entrance. Ethan noticed the cardboard box beside Grace's feet filled with handmade centerpieces she had crafted from dried wheat, pine cones, and tiny glass jars wrapped with twine. "You made all of these?" he asked. Grace nodded quietly. "Just something simple. I thought they would make the tables feel warmer." Ethan looked carefully at each arrangement before answering. "They do." His words were plain, almost ordinary, but they carried none of the empty politeness Grace had grown accustomed to hearing. He meant them. Lily crouched beside one centerpiece and gently touched the ribbon tied around the jar. Daddy always says little things make people feel at home. Ethan smiled faintly. That is true. Grace lowered her eyes again, uncertain how to respond. Compliments had become unfamiliar after years of whispers and sideways glances. She had almost forgotten what sincerity sounded like. Around them, conversations rose and fell like distant waves. Coffee continued pouring. Chairs scraped softly against the polished floor. The comforting smell of baked apples mixed with cedar wood from the old church walls. It felt like every ordinary detail of the evening was quietly reminding Ethan why he loved small towns despite their imperfections. Places like Cedar Ridge remembered birthdays, gathered for funerals, rebuilt barns after storms, and cooked meals for grieving families. Yet sometimes those same communities forgot how deeply loneliness could settle into a person's life when everyone decided to look away. Ethan understood that feeling better than most. After his wife, Hannah, passed away, there had been evenings when silence filled their little farmhouse so completely that even the ticking kitchen clock sounded unbearably loud. Lily had been only 5 years old then. She had climbed onto his lap one night and asked if people stopped smiling forever after someone they loved went to heaven. Ethan had promised her they did not. He promised that kindness was how people slowly found their smiles again. Since then, every morning before school, they had shared one simple tradition. During breakfast, each of them named one person who might need a little extra kindness that day. Sometimes it was an elderly neighbor. Sometimes it was a lonely classmate. Sometimes it was the cashier who looked tired after working long hours. Tonight, without saying it aloud, Ethan realized that Grace Bennett had become the answer to that quiet morning tradition. He was not looking at the scar that everyone else seemed unable to ignore. He was looking at a woman who had spent the entire evening making strangers feel welcome while expecting nothing in return, and somehow that seemed far more beautiful than anything the room had bothered to notice. Grace looked as though she wanted to say something, but years of disappointment had taught her that hope was often more painful than silence. She adjusted the worn strap of her canvas bag over her shoulder and offered the kind of polite smile that people practiced after hearing too many excuses. "Thank you," she said softly. "Most people only notice the decorations if something is wrong with them." Ethan shook his head. "Then they are looking at the wrong things." Grace studied him for a brief moment, uncertain whether to believe him. Honest words had become so rare that they almost sounded unfamiliar. Before she could answer, one of the volunteers called Ethan's name from across the room, asking if he could help move another folding table. He nodded politely, but did not rush away. "Would you mind waiting a minute?" he asked Grace. "I would like to introduce you to someone properly." She blinked with quiet surprise. "Someone?" Ethan smiled toward Lily. The little girl stepped forward with complete confidence, as children often do before they learn the complicated rules adults invent. "Miss Grace," Lily said, "Daddy says every person has a story. What is your favorite story?" Grace laughed before she realized she was laughing. It was a small sound, almost hidden, but genuine enough that even she seemed startled by it. "My favorite story," she repeated. Lily nodded enthusiastically. "Mine is Charlotte's Web. Daddy cries every time we read the ending." Ethan chuckled softly. "That is supposed to stay between us." Grace covered her smile with one hand. "I think that is a wonderful secret." For the first time that evening, the heaviness around her shoulders seemed to lift. Nearby, however, several guests noticed the conversation and quietly exchanged puzzled looks. They had expected Ethan to leave after offering a few polite words. Instead, he remained exactly where he was, speaking with Grace as naturally as if they had been neighbors for years. The whispers began almost immediately. "What is he doing?" one man muttered. "Does he actually know her?" Another woman whispered while stirring cream into her coffee. "Someone probably dared him." Their voices stayed low, but not low enough. Grace had spent enough years hearing half-finished conversations to recognize the rhythm of judgment before a single sentence was completed. She lowered her eyes again, preparing herself for the familiar ending. Ethan noticed the change instantly. Without looking toward the whispering crowd, he picked up one of the centerpieces from her box. He examined every detail, from the carefully polished mason jar to the tiny sprigs of cedar tucked between the dried wheat. "How long did this take you?" he asked. Grace hesitated. "About 3 evenings after work." 3 evenings. Ethan repeated. "That is a gift, not a decoration." She shrugged gently. "People usually do not notice." "Then they should." The words were calm, almost quiet, yet they carried enough conviction that Lily beamed with pride. She reached into the box and held up another arrangement. "Daddy, can we take one home after tonight? It would look pretty on our kitchen table." Grace's eyes widened. "You really want one?" Lily answered without hesitation. "Of course. It looks like somebody made it with love." The room around them continued buzzing with conversation, but for Grace, the noise seemed to fade beneath those simple words. She had spent years believing that people only saw what had been taken from her. Standing beside Ethan and Lily, she began wondering if perhaps, just perhaps, someone was finally seeing everything she still had to give. Across the fellowship hall, the annual dessert auction was about to begin. Volunteers rolled out long tables covered with homemade pies, quilts stitched by retired teachers, carved wooden birdhouses, and baskets filled with local honey and homemade jam. The cheerful voice of the master of ceremonies echoed through the microphone, inviting everyone to gather closer. Folding chairs scraped gently across the polished floor as families settled in, balancing paper plates of cobbler and steaming cups of coffee. Ethan glanced toward the crowd, then back at Grace. "Would you join us?" he asked. Grace instinctively looked behind her, almost certain he was speaking to someone else. "Me?" she asked quietly. "Yes," Ethan replied with an easy smile. "There are 3 empty chairs. It seems a shame to leave one of them empty." Grace hesitated. Years of sitting alone had taught her that empty seats often stayed empty for a reason. Before she could answer, Lily slipped her small hand into Grace's. "Please come," she said. "Daddy says dinners taste better when nobody eats alone." Grace felt her throat tighten. She could not remember the last time someone had invited her without pity hidden beneath the invitation. Slowly, she nodded. Together they walked toward one of the round tables near the front of the hall. The movement caught nearly every eye in the room. Conversations softened. Several people stopped in the middle of pouring coffee. Others exchanged knowing glances that carried more assumptions than kindness. A man near the auction table leaned toward his wife and whispered, "I cannot believe he is actually doing it." Another quietly replied, "Give it 5 minutes. He is probably just being polite." Ethan heard neither comment, or perhaps he simply chose not to. He pulled out a chair for Grace before taking his own seat. Then he helped Lily settle between them as naturally as if this arrangement had been planned from the beginning. Grace folded her hands in her lap, uncertain where to look. The warm glow from the hanging lights reflected softly against the mason jar centerpiece she had made herself earlier that week. For the first time all evening, she was sitting at a table instead of standing against a wall. Across the room, the master of ceremonies smiled broadly, unaware of the quiet story unfolding just a few yards away. "Looks like we have room for one more friendship tonight," he joked into the microphone, earning scattered laughter from the audience. Some people laughed warmly. Others laughed because everyone else did. Grace lowered her head, believing once again that she had become the evening's unspoken entertainment. Ethan noticed the familiar sadness returning to her expression. He reached for the basket of dinner rolls and placed one gently onto her plate before serving himself. "These disappear fast," he said casually. "Trust me, you want one before Lily decides she is still growing." Lily giggled. "Daddy says I have a hollow leg." Grace smiled despite herself. "My grandmother used to say that to me." Ethan looked at her with genuine curiosity. "Then your grandmother sounds like someone I would have liked." The simple conversation continued as though the whispers surrounding them did not exist. Questions about favorite books turned into stories about childhood Christmases, county fairs, baking recipes, and old family traditions. Every answer invited another. Every smile came a little easier than the one before. Around them, the room slowly grew quieter. The people who had expected awkwardness found themselves watching something entirely different. They were witnessing two lonely adults speaking with effortless respect, while a little girl between them smiled as though she had been waiting for this conversation far longer than anyone realized. As dinner plates were cleared away and volunteers carried empty trays toward the kitchen, the old piano near the stage began playing a slow country waltz that many couples in Cedar Ridge had danced to for years. Soft amber lights reflected across polished hardwood floors while conversations blended into warm laughter, the scent of cinnamon, fresh coffee, and baked pecans lingering comfortably in the air. The master of ceremonies smiled into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, before the auction continues, let us enjoy a little community dance. Nobody leaves without at least one song." Chairs shifted as husbands reached for wives. Grandparents found familiar hands, and children hurried toward the open floor. Grace instinctively gathered her purse. "I should probably head home," she said quietly. "It is getting late." Ethan looked at her with calm understanding. "Only if that is what you truly want." She hesitated. "I do not want to make anyone uncomfortable." Ethan glanced around the room, where curious eyes still drifted toward their table every few moments. Then he looked back at Grace with the same steady expression she had begun trusting. "Sometimes," he said softly, "people become uncomfortable because kindness reminds them of opportunities they missed." Grace lowered her eyes, unable to answer. Lily suddenly tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered with complete innocence, "Mom always said every lady deserves to dance at least once." Ethan's face softened at the memory. Hannah had believed that simple gestures often carried the deepest meaning. He stood slowly and offered his hand toward Grace. There was no dramatic flourish, no audience seeking permission, only an open hand resting patiently between them. "Miss Bennett," he said gently, "would you honor me with this dance?" The fellowship hall seemed to pause. Nearby conversations faded into uncertain silence. A fork slipped softly onto a plate somewhere across the room. Even the volunteers arranging auction baskets slowed their work without realizing it. Grace stared at Ethan's hand as though it belonged to another world. "You cannot be serious," she whispered. "I am. People are watching." Ethan smiled kindly. "Then perhaps they will remember what respect looks like." Grace's fingers trembled almost imperceptibly before she placed her hand in his. It was the first time in many years that anyone had invited her onto a dance floor. Ethan led her with quiet confidence toward the center of the hall. He did not hurry. He did not look around to see who was watching. His attention remained entirely on the woman walking beside him. Lily stayed near the edge of the floor, smiling so brightly that several older church members found themselves smiling back without knowing why. As the music filled the room, Ethan rested one respectful hand lightly at Grace's shoulder while their other hands remained gently joined. The distance between them reflected dignity rather than performance, kindness rather than spectacle. They moved slowly with the rhythm, neither trying to impress nor pretending the room had disappeared. Grace felt years of fear begin to loosen with every quiet step. "I have forgotten how to dance," she admitted with a nervous laugh. Ethan answered just above the music. "No, I think the world simply forgot to ask." Grace looked into his eyes, searching for pity, amusement, or hidden sympathy. She found none of them. There was only sincere respect. Around the dance floor, something unexpected happened. The whispering stopped. The smiling became thoughtful. People who had laughed earlier now watched in complete silence, realizing that the most unforgettable moment of the evening was not the music, the auction, or the fundraiser. It was one ordinary man choosing to treat one overlooked woman exactly as she had always deserved to be treated. The applause that followed the dance was not loud. It was hesitant, almost uncertain, as though the room had forgotten whether it was celebrating the music or apologizing for everything that had happened before it. Ethan and Grace returned to their table without fanfare. He pulled out her chair once again before sitting beside Lily, who looked from one adult to the other with the satisfied smile of someone whose heart understood more than words could explain. The auction resumed, yet very few people seemed interested in the handmade quilts or fishing trips being offered from the stage. Their attention kept drifting back toward the quiet trio seated beneath the warm glow of hanging lights. Grace folded her napkin carefully in her lap, still trying to make sense of an evening that had unfolded unlike any she had experienced in years. She finally looked at Ethan. "Can I ask you something?" she said softly. "Of course." She hesitated before speaking again. "Why did you ask me to dance?" Ethan leaned back slightly, considering the question with the same thoughtfulness he gave almost everything. "Because I wanted to." Grace smiled faintly. "Most people want a reason that sounds bigger than that." Ethan shook his head. "Kindness does not need a complicated reason." Before Grace could answer, Lily gently tugged at her father's sleeve again. "Daddy," she whispered, "can I tell Miss Grace our secret?" Ethan laughed quietly. "I think that depends on which secret." Lily leaned toward Grace with complete seriousness. "Every night before bed, Daddy and I pray for somebody." Grace blinked. "You do?" Lily nodded. "Sometimes it is Mr. Collins because he lives by himself. Sometimes it is Mrs. Harper because her knees hurt when it snows. Sometimes it is kids at school who sit alone during lunch." She smiled proudly. "Daddy says lonely people should never have to stay lonely if we can help it." Grace felt something catch in her chest. Ethan looked slightly embarrassed, rubbing the back of his neck. "That was supposed to stay between us two." Lily giggled. "I keep forgetting." Grace's eyes glistened beneath the warm lights. "You really pray for strangers?" Ethan answered quietly. "Not strangers for very long." The words settled between them with surprising weight. Around the hall, volunteers continued wrapping auction baskets with clear cellophane. The piano player shifted into another gentle melody while the scent of fresh coffee drifted through the room once more. Outside, the first snowflakes of the season floated silently beneath the streetlights, barely visible through the old church windows. Grace stared into her untouched coffee. After the accident, she said almost above a whisper, "People were kind for a little while. Then life moved on for everyone except me." She paused before continuing. "Eventually, they stopped seeing Grace and started seeing only the scar." Ethan listened without interruption. He did not rush to reassure her or search for perfect words. He simply remained present, allowing her story the dignity of being heard. Grace gave a small, uncertain laugh. "I almost stopped coming to these dinners because it hurts less to stay home." Lily reached across the table and gently placed her tiny hand over Grace's. "I am glad you came anyway." Grace looked down at the little hand resting on hers, and one quiet tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. Ethan noticed, but did not pretend not to see. He quietly offered his neatly folded handkerchief across the table. "Thank you," Grace whispered as she accepted it. Ethan smiled warmly. "You never have to thank someone for treating you like you matter." At that moment, several nearby guests who had unintentionally overheard the conversation lowered their eyes in silence, because for the first time that evening they realized the deepest wound Grace carried had never been the scar on her face. It had been the years spent believing that no one would ever choose to truly see her again. For several long moments, no one at the neighboring tables spoke. The laughter that had filled the fellowship hall earlier seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the quiet clinking of coffee cups and the gentle rustle of auction sheets being passed from hand to hand. Grace carefully folded Ethan's handkerchief after drying her eyes and held it with both hands, as though it were something far more valuable than a simple piece of cloth. She looked across the table at Lily, who whose bright smile remained untouched by the complicated opinions of adults. "Your father is raising you into a remarkable young lady," Grace said softly. Lily immediately shook her head. "He says he is still learning too." Ethan smiled at his daughter. "That part is true." Before anyone could continue, an older woman slowly approached their table carrying a small plate with a slice of pecan pie. It was Martha Ellis, one of the longest-serving church volunteers, a woman whose silver hair and gentle voice had comforted generations of families in Cedar Ridge. She stopped beside Grace and stood quietly for a moment before speaking. "Grace," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I owe you an apology." The nearby conversations faded again. Martha looked down at her hands before meeting Grace's eyes. "Years ago, after your accident, I kept telling myself that I would visit you. I planned to bring dinner. I planned to call. I planned to invite you back to our Bible study." She took a slow breath. "I kept planning until too much time had passed, and then I became embarrassed that I had waited so long. I convinced myself you probably did not want to see me." Grace listened without interrupting. Martha's eyes filled with tears. "The truth is, I failed you. Not because I disliked you, but because I allowed my comfort to matter more than your loneliness." Ethan lowered his eyes respectfully, allowing the moment to belong entirely to the two women. Around them, several guests quietly turned toward the table, hearing every word. Grace reached across and gently touched Martha's hand. "You came tonight," she said. "That still means something." Martha nodded, unable to answer immediately. "It means far less than it should have." Another familiar voice joined from behind. It was Daniel Brooks, the owner of the local hardware store. He removed his baseball cap and held it against his chest. "I should probably say something too," he admitted. "Every time you walked into my store, I hurried through our conversations because I did not know what to say. Looking back now, I realize silence can be just as hurtful as cruel words." One by one, more neighbors drifted closer. No one argued. No one defended themselves. The room had quietly become a place of honest reflection instead of easy conversation. Ethan noticed Lily watching everything with thoughtful eyes. She leaned closer and whispered, "Daddy, are they all saying they were wrong?" Ethan answered just as quietly, "I think they are remembering who they wanted to be." Lily looked around the room once more and smiled gently. "Then maybe everybody gets another chance." Grace heard those words and closed her eyes for a brief moment. She had spent years believing that forgiveness belonged only in sermons and greeting cards, never in ordinary life. Yet standing around her now were neighbors who had finally stopped pretending nothing had happened. There was no dramatic speech, no perfect explanation, only humble hearts discovering that respect delayed was still better than respect denied forever. And somewhere deep inside Grace, a door that had remained locked through countless lonely seasons began opening just enough to let hope quietly find its way home. The fellowship hall remained unusually still long after the last apology had been spoken. Outside, snow continued drifting gently across the church parking lot, covering old pickup trucks and family sedans beneath a thin white blanket that reflected the warm glow spilling from the stained glass windows. Inside, the auction had quietly come to a pause. Even the master of ceremonies lowered his microphone onto the podium, sensing that no announcement could compete with what everyone had just witnessed. Grace sat motionless, her fingers still wrapped around the folded handkerchief Ethan had given her. She looked around the room and saw faces she had known for years, faces that suddenly seemed different, not because they had changed overnight, but because they were finally looking back at her instead of looking away. Ethan stood slowly from his chair and walked a few steps toward the center of the room. Several guests instinctively turned to watch him, uncertain what he intended to say. He glanced briefly toward Lily, who smiled with quiet encouragement, then back at Grace. His voice was calm, carrying easily through the silent hall without ever becoming loud. "There is something I have been thinking about all evening." No one interrupted. Ethan looked around the room before continuing. We spend so much time teaching our children to be careful with their words. We remind them not to make fun of people. We tell them to include the lonely kid at school. We tell them character matters more than appearance. He paused for a moment. Somewhere along the way, adults forget to live by the same lessons. The words settled gently over the room. No accusation. No anger. Only truth spoken with quiet grace. Ethan turned toward Grace again and took one slow step closer. "Miss Bennett," he said softly, "I cannot imagine everything these past years have been like for you." Grace lowered her eyes, unable to answer. "But I hope tonight reminds you of something that should never have been forgotten." Ethan stopped in front of her. He did not rush. He did not try to create a dramatic moment. Instead, he simply bent slightly until they were at eye level, allowing his words to belong only to her even though the entire room was listening. "You have never needed someone to fix you," he said gently. "You have only needed people willing to see you." Grace's lips trembled. Tears gathered once more, not from sadness alone, but from hearing the one sentence she had waited years for someone to speak. Ethan reached into the centerpiece box resting beside the table and carefully picked up the very first arrangement Grace had made. He held it for a brief moment before placing it back into her hands. "You spent 3 evenings making beauty for people who rarely noticed you." His smile was warm and sincere. "Thank you for choosing kindness anyway." Grace could no longer hold back her tears. She covered her mouth as quiet sobs escaped through grateful smiles. Lily hurried over and wrapped both arms around Grace's waist without saying a single word. The simple embrace seemed to unlock something inside the room itself. Martha Ellis quietly wiped her eyes. Daniel Brooks removed his glasses to hide his own tears. One by one, more people reached for tissues or lowered their heads. There was no applause, no cheering, only the unmistakable sound of hearts recognizing a truth they had overlooked for far too long. In that sacred silence, no one saw a scar anymore. They saw a gracious woman who had never stopped giving, a devoted father who refused to let dignity become optional, and a little girl whose innocent compassion had quietly reminded an entire community what love truly looked like. 1 year later, the first Saturday of November brought the Harvest Hope fundraiser back to St. Andrew's Community Church, and Cedar Ridge seemed to wear a different kind of warmth. Fresh wreaths hung from every doorway, strings of soft white lights wrapped around the old wooden beams, and the familiar scent of cinnamon, pine, and homemade bread welcomed neighbors through the front doors. Children raced across the fellowship hall carrying paper snowflakes, while volunteers laughed as they arranged auction baskets along the stage. Yet something had changed far beyond the decorations. Near the entrance stood a display of handcrafted centerpieces woven from dried wheat, cedar branches, and glass jars tied with simple twine. A small handwritten sign rested beside them. Grace Bennett's Community Workshop. All proceeds supporting local families in need. People gathered around the table, admiring every piece and thanking Grace for sharing her gift. No one looked away anymore. They looked directly at her, greeted her by name, and lingered long enough to hear her stories. Across the room, Ethan Walker carried trays of hot cider while Lily, now a little taller, proudly helped younger children hang ornaments on a Christmas-giving tree. Every few minutes someone stopped Ethan simply to shake his hand, not because of anything extraordinary he had accomplished, but because quiet dignity had become impossible to forget. Grace walked toward him carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "1 cream," she said with a smile. "Still the same?" Ethan accepted the mug with grateful eyes. "You remembered." Grace laughed softly. "Some things are worth remembering." Lily hurried over and slipped naturally between them, wrapping one arm around Ethan and the other around Grace. There was no hesitation anymore. It had become the most ordinary thing in the world. Martha Ellis approached with tears already forming in her eyes. "I wanted you both to know something," she said. "After last year's dinner, 5 new volunteer groups started visiting people who lived alone. We have more neighbors sharing meals together now than ever before. Daniel Brooks smiled as he joined them. And every new employee at my hardware store hears the same thing on their first day. Around here, we notice people before we notice appearances. Grace looked around the fellowship hall. Couples danced. Children laughed. Elderly neighbors shared pie at tables that no longer left anyone sitting by themselves. The loneliness that had once filled the room so quietly had given way to something gentler, something stronger. Ethan glanced toward the old piano where a familiar waltz began playing once again. He extended his hand toward Grace exactly as he had 1 year earlier. "Would you care to dance?" She smiled before placing her hand in his. "I thought you would never ask." As they stepped onto the dance floor, no whispers followed them. No curious stares. Only warm smiles from people who had learned that compassion often begins with one simple choice. Lily watched them for a moment before looking up at the stained glass windows glowing against the evening sky. She whispered almost to herself, "Mom would have loved this." Ethan heard her and gently rested his free hand on her shoulder as they danced. "I think she does." Outside, soft snow settled quietly across Cedar Ridge while warm lights spilled from the church windows into the peaceful night. Sometimes miracles did not arrive in long lines of luxury vehicles or dramatic surprises. Sometimes they began with an open chair, an offered hand, and the courage to see another human being exactly as they had always deserved to be seen. And in the end, the moment everyone remembered was never the laughter that filled the room. It was the silence that followed when kindness finally spoke louder than judgment.